Bristol Vanguard are the organisers of VAE VICTIS 2025, and they do things a little differently by adding some twists to the typical tournament scene, shaking things up for your usual preparation. Let's take a look at some alternative and fun-looking Warhammer 40,000 formats, alongside a second-place Space Wolves list that went 4-1-0 at this event. Welcome to My Mini Grimdark. Before we get into the list, let's take a look at the tournament setup itself, because it's quite different from the norm. It isn't entirely unusual for organisers to do things a little differently for their local community, and Bristol Vanguard created a competitive scene at VAE VICTIS that tested players in an alternative format. Something that's really important for the game, in my opinion. So, to set the scene, in order to attend this event each year, you'll need to find yourself in the lovely cathedral city of Bristol, UK. About 120 miles west of London and only about 25 miles east of Cardiff, the city straddles the River Avon, and as someone who frequents semi-regularly for work, I can confirm it's a pretty nice part of the world. VAE VICTIS is a one-day event, this year held on the 27th of September. Regular tournament players may raise their eyebrows straight away. A one-day event, you say? How can this be possible? Does time run differently in Bristol? Well, maybe. But that's not why we're here. One of the things that sets this event apart primarily is that rather than the usual 2,000 point army size, players bring armies constructed up to 700 points. In my local group, we regularly play around with different points limits. It makes for interesting list building, as the restrictions for small scale forces make you forego some of the units you'd typically take. At 2,000 points, you can usually take units that have very specific utility roles on the table. For example, at 1,000 points, you'll generally have to sacrifice some of your more expensive units to maintain body count on the table for board control. At 700 points, your units are likely going to be more carefully chosen between those that can fulfill multiple roles, because you often won't be able to have units that do just one thing at this scale. And of course, with much smaller forces, games are a lot faster. These are 90-minute games of Warhammer 40,000, and this means an entire event can be held between 9 o'clock in the morning and 7 o'clock in the evening. Excellent. Bristol Vanguard have considered a few other factors, though, ensuring the best experience for their players. Firstly, the tournament does utilise the chapter-approved 2025 mission deck for incursion games, but this has been tailored for smaller forces with games played on smaller 44-inch by 30-inch tables. If you've ever played a game of 40k on a smaller table, you'll know the impact that this has. Both forces have much less room to move, to deep strike into, to hide from each other, with objectives inevitably closer together. The fighting can very quickly bottleneck for one player or the other if units are overcommitted. So everything so far lends towards a smaller format and faster games of 40k. As a side note, by the way, this is what I think Combat Patrol should be. Not a different format with different data sheets as it is now, but a smaller scale format of 40k that's fully realised and changes the battlefield and the army building, not the units and the army rules. Bristol Vanguard had then added a number of stipulations on list building that, when you consider them in the context of the small tables and forces, make a ton of sense and obviously lend towards a more balanced experience that again lends into fast-paced gaming. Every army must take at least one battle line unit, no more than 2 battle line units. This forces players to have at least one unit of infantry and stops armies spamming bodies onto the table to overwhelm the opponent. I imagine the 90-minute game is a factor here again as well. If anyone's ever played against infantry-heavy Imperial Guard forces, you'll know what I mean when I say that horde armies can slow up games during the movement phase, even if they're fun to chew through with blood claws. Armies can only have a maximum of 2 units for every other data sheet. Again, this makes sense to avoid spamming top units. Every unit can only be a maximum of 10 models. I couldn't see it specified, but I'll assume this is pre-leaders tagged onto the unit since they join as opposed to being part of the unit at this point in the process. This would mean no blocks of 20 blood claws though for Space Wolves. Additionally, no unit can cost more than 215 points. This rule specifically states that leaders count as separate units and don't impact on this. It's a clever rule that stops armies being able to bring single powerhouse units that, frankly, might just be unkillable at 700 points and completely unfun to play against. No aircrafts wise on the small tables though, since aircrafts are seemingly on Games Workshop's thou shalt not playlist with generally underwhelming rules across the board. It's a little bit of a formality. I'll get my World Eater's Helldrake onto the competitive table one day maybe. No models with more than 14 wounds. Again, angling towards ensuring no game-busting units find their way into armies. At a glance, ignoring allies, I think this would literally only be the repulsors with their 16 wounds out of the list from Codex Space Marines and Codex Supplement Space Wolves. Executioners and Land Raiders are already out of the options due to being above the 215 point limit for a single unit. Do let me know in the comments if there's anything I've missed though. No models with 11 or more toughness. You'll still have the option of a gladiator and all of your dreadnoughts are still available. But when you start to look at the loadouts of these units, you're going to do so from a very different perspective. You already know you're not going to be coming up against titans and knights and tons of high wound count, massive toughness units. So suddenly my usual go-to Lancer Laser Destroyer doesn't feel like it has the same value anymore. It's kind of overkill at this point. Frankly, and interestingly, the Gladiator Valiant feels more appropriate than the Gladiator Lancer all of a sudden. Something that might cause a bit of an outward groan amongst the Space Wolves community: no epic heroes. We've got so much great choice in our range at the moment, it's almost unheard of to see a 2,000 point list that doesn't have at least one epic hero in it, and generally you'd expect to see Aryak, Logan and Bjorn there together in the competitive scene. I do like this rule though, it feels right from a narrative perspective, and from a gaming perspective, not only does it remove often difficult to balance character abilities from consideration, it also forces players to think outside of their usual box. I quite like that the organisers called out specifically that you can use your beautiful epic hero models as proxies for other models. So if you've got a beautifully painted Bjorn that you want to put on the table, you could run him simply as a Venerable Dreadnought. And finally, not an unusual one for these events, fully painted armies to battle ready standard at least get plus 10 victory points in each game and entry to the tiered best painted army competition. This one can be a little divisive sometimes, but I personally think players should be rewarded for getting their armies painted up. Let's face it, whether you love this part of the hobby or not, it's no small challenge. The great thing about 700 points, as we'll see in a moment, is that it's so much more accessible for newer players in particular to be able to experience the tournament scene without feeling like they're disadvantaged because they weren't able to get their army painted up. 700 points is much more doable than 2,000 points. Anyway, I love this. Warhammer 40,000 is my ice cream. I enjoy all flavours, and you know what? Sometimes I'm in the mood for good old-fashioned 2,000 point chocolate games. Usually, though, I'm a 1,000 point strawberry kind of guy. Every now and then, though, I realise how much I love rum and raisin and smaller game formats. Every player that attended this tournament was forced to rethink their list building, not because Games Workshop nerfed their army with sometimes arbitrary points increases. Yes, Games Workshop, we haven't forgiven you for September yet, but because the format of the games require it. Even if you push the rules for the event aside for a moment, you're still contending with a smaller table. Infiltrators will still have a purpose in a 44 by 30 table, but is the Infiltrate Premium really worth the points cost at this scale? Given that you're going to be engaging in the enemy much faster anyway, do you really want your more expensive units and potentially a large chunk of your army in reserves? As good as Thunderwolf Cavalry are on a smaller table, is their premium worth it for that speed and a threat range that just might not be necessary now? Loads for you to consider when you're constructing armies at this scale. You're forced to put real consideration into your list building and how it might need to be different for this format versus other formats. And this is how it should be, and this is why it's good for the game. So with all of this in mind, let's take a look at Iain Durham's list. Iain came in second in the tournament, going 4-1-0 with his Space Wolves. This list shows that where Space Wolves might lack variety in larger games, without bringing Codex Space Marines units to the table that is, in smaller formats, we have an excellent selection and we're very well equipped for scrapping on those smaller confined tables. Let's start with the characters. We've got a Wolfguard Battle Leader and a Wolf Priest. The Wolfguard Battle Leader is in the army as the Warlord, and we can already guess where he's going since he's got the enhancement Wolf Touched. In this format in particular, the Thunder Hammer is going to be impactful for thrashing through tougher foes, and the Storm Shield gives him an extra wound. At 200 points, a unit of 10 Wolfen with Storm Shields would be a huge portion of the army taken up, so Iain's gone with a unit of 5 with Storm Shields for 100 points. Their high toughness and 4+ invulnerable saves makes them trickier to take down, and with a movement of 9 inches, they'll get across those small battlefields faster than many opponents will be able to deal with. And they're very capable of taking down bigger and tougher foes, especially with the battle leader's rerolls of 1 to hit to bolster their output. It's also important to note that a Wolfen unit without a leader is going to be more challenging in these smaller game formats because you might need them to score points. Remember, you don't have many units. There's going to be a real chance that your Wolfen are going to end up on an objective at some point. Being able to activate Curse of the Wolfen with a leader in the unit could be game-winning. The Wolf Priest has a couple of options and I'm torn between them. There is a Blood Claws unit and his +1 to wound buff makes them a lot more threatening even when they lack AP. I think this is where I'd lean to putting him. The unit's a strong melee unit and with advance and charge natively, they can just flood forward. The Impetuosity stratagem in Saga of the Beastslayer feels good value on a smaller table, allowing the Blood Claws to surge move if they take a casualty to ranged fire, further closing the gap between them and the opponent. As battle line units go, Blood Claws are one of the more useful at the moment, so the fact that we have to take a unit in this category isn't really a problem for Space Wolves players at all. That said, the Wolf Priest does have 2 identical units of head takers he could lean into as well. He could lead as well, and there's argument for popping him into either of these instead of the Blood Claws. The only reason I lean into the Blood Claws is that Wolf Priest turns them into a decent threat for tougher foes, where without +1 to wound, they'd really struggle, and the head takers can, frankly, swing up happily against most enemy infantry without any need for buffing. Both units are head takers are 3-man units with Storm Shields for the 4+ invulnerable saves. These units have solid output in their own right with 4 attacks each, -2 AP and 2 damage. But their smaller unit size and relative pace makes them ideal for closing down winning objectives and scoring points. They're pretty well placed for completing secondaries on smaller battlefields against smaller armies, and you've got much better chance of activating your Headhunter's ability for devastating wounds against your chosen prey. Although they're an elite unit, being able to take them in small units of 3 means Space Wolves can spread resources even in small matchups like 700-point games, with multiple impactful units to gain early board control. Finally, to round out the list, a Venerable Dreadnought. We could argue all day about its ideal loadouts. Check out my video above for more detail, but in summary there aren't really any bad choices. It's a well-designed datasheet that gives you a single unit with so many potential roles depending on how you equipped it. Iain's gone with one of my preferred, the Blizzard Shield with Great Axe and Heavy Flamer. A toughness 9 and 8 wounds, 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save. Thanks to that Blizzard Shield, this makes the unit pretty durable in most matchups. When you know your opponent is going to lack some of the biggest guns they'd maybe have at 2,000 points, this durability is even more so. The Fenrisian Great Axe will have no issue in this game size either, and giving and getting +1 to advance rolls means that running it alongside those Blood Claws or Head Takers will make covering ground that little bit faster. A few things you'll notice that aren't here that might usually be expected in bigger games. No range support at all. Love this. Talk about speeding up a game, Iain. Don't bother having any shooting phase. No dedicated utility units with combi lieutenants, intercessors, infiltrators or scouts. You pay a premium for these units for their utility, and this is always a balancing act even in bigger games, since most of them struggle to contribute beyond that utility in most matchups. I'd chop them at this points level too, in favour of units that can do damage as well as score points. No Wolfguard Terminators. You could bring them, but it's obviously an expensive unit, so you'd definitely have more of an elite feel army as a result. No reason why they couldn't work though. I've taken Terminators at this scale and actually lean towards the Stormbolters rather than the shields, so they can park on an objective and still contribute from range a little. There are so many units in the Space Wolf supplement that could enjoy this format, and the real fun happens when those usual throwaway units like Blood Claws, or that Dreadnought that usually gets turned into scrap in round 3 by a well-placed railgun, get to be your heroes on these smaller game formats. You'll come to appreciate them when you don't have an Aryak Rockfist inside a 10-strong Terminator bubble to lean on. It's a really fun format that forces things to be changed up, and you could lift the event rules that Bristol Vanguard have put in place here to create some fun and fast casual games at home as well. Great list, Iain. Thank you. Well done for your 4-1-0 second place finish. Congratulations. And well done, Bristol Vanguard, on creating a great looking tournament setup. Love seeing organisers stretch players outside of the norms. Very cool. What do you think? Know any tournaments near to you that change things up to keep them fresh? How would your 700 points look in these constraints? Thanks for watching. Keep hobbying.